This is What's Wild in New Hampshire by wildlife biologist Eric Orff. I have New Hampshire Fish and Game Department's retired first moose biologist, Chris Rhines. We're up here today, June 1st, 2022. Chris, tell us, I want to know about the history of moose management in New Hampshire. You know a little bit about that, I bet.
If I can remember.
She's been retired 3 years now, as of 3 years as of July. So
Yep.
you're at it for a good number of years.
Yes. So I was with the department for 37.
37 years.
Yep. So, and for all but 2.5 of those, I was the moose biologist.
35 years. Good.
Yep. So one of the first things we recognized is before any management could take place, we needed to educate people because there was a lot of misinformation about moose, and people were very concerned that any kind of management would cause them to become extinct. And so we did a huge education program. And in fact, the National Wildlife Federation helped us with that. And they helped us put together a large, and put basically all of our information on a pamphlet. And the pamphlet was placed in the Manchester Union Leader.
Yeah, the New Hampshire Wildlife Federation, I think it was. Yep.
It was actually the National.
Or was it the National?
It was
cool.
the National
Wow.
Wildlife Federation.
Okay.
And they helped us write it and
wow,
get
that's
the information
interesting.
out. So that was really helpful. And so for 3 years, we basically went all over the state and gave talks wherever
yep.
to
On the
large
road.
and small audiences, and talked to people. And then finally we went forward with a proposal for a management plan, very small, just the northern portion of the state. Only 75 permits, just a 3-day season.
Yep.
And permits would be apportioned across different management units. And that passed. That was approved, and a majority of the public approved of it. And so we were able to start our first hunt in 1988. And as the moose population continued to grow, at that time of the first hunt, we felt we had about 1,600 moose. And as the population continued to grow, the hunt grew with it. And then, we did a huge amount of research, really, for such a small state with minimal funding. And
you counted moose several different ways, right?
yeah, so we started with basically a deer hunter observation rate of moose.
Yep.
And we actually looked at Scandinavia for that.
Okay.
That's the way they managed their moose and
Okay.
counted their moose, with a hunter observation rate. So we took a page out of their notebook and utilized that. And then we decided to also try infrared thermal imagery. And so we banded together really with UNH, because it's such a small department. Thank you. We really didn't have the time to do the research ourselves.
Right.
So Dr. Peter Peekins was very influential and helped us enormously in developing the right questions to ask, and get really good students to work on our projects, and worked very cooperatively with us.
Yep.
And so, we did a lot of work together, from learning how to use infrared thermal imagery, which at that time was brand new. And we learned a lot about what was possible and what was not. And then from that, we learned that, in fact, our hunter observation rates were valid and were doing a good job. So we went back to using those. And then we did further research on what habitats were important to moose and what reproduction looked like and mortality rates and what was causing moose to die, because it was obvious to us over time that reproduction wasn't what it used to be.
So back in 88 or 86, 87, a lot of the cows were producing 2 calves each after what, age 3 typically?
And they were producing annually, and the population was just climbing almost incrementally year after year, and then it seemed to kind of plateau, even though habitat still looked fine and we felt we still had sufficient forage. It didn't seem to be forage, but things just weren't looking good. And we knew that winter tick was a problem in other areas, and so that's when we once again went to UNH and said, look, we've got to find out what's killing moose, because something aside from our hunt is causing these animals to not do well. And in fact, over the years, we found out that winter tick was the primary reason for reduced reproduction, dramatically increased mortality in calves and in some adults. And so this was kind of, I won't say exciting, but it was very important, because a lot of jurisdictions knew they had winter tick, but didn't feel it was as big a player as it turns out that it.
Including Maine, I might add, because when
Right.
New Hampshire got the first high mortality rates, I talked to Lee. Oh, that's not happening in northern Maine. That's only happening in New Hampshire.
Right, and so we tried to work with both Vermont and Maine and bring them in and have them also do studies similar to our own, so that we could look at how climate and differences in weather patterns were actually influencing the tick, because it seemed to us that our general climate patterns were changing, and this was influencing how ticks were influencing moose. And sure enough, over time, we could see that a warmer climate, which was giving us longer, drier falls with less snow, were allowing ticks to look for moose for a longer period of time, which allowed more ticks to get on the moose. So moose were carrying this very heavy tick load into winter. It was causing the cows to be very stressed, unable to produce, because they simply didn't have the bodily resources they needed for productivity, and causing calves that at that point were like 6 months old going into winter to die before their first birthday.
Maine just had a 90% of the moose calves died in the winter of 2022 here in Maine, and there's no reason to think the same thing didn't happen in New Hampshire, right? Because when you were doing the study, it was the same across all 3 states.
Well, but there is one factor that influences ticks that is not weather related, and that's numbers of moose.
Okay, yep.
So, and in some aspects, habitat. So as your moose numbers grow,
right,
you have more ticks on the landscape. So it's actually in the moose's best interest to have lower population levels of moose, so that ticks simply don't have the opportunity to grow, because there are fewer ticks on the landscape to start with. And also, at that same time, it's important to make sure that forage for moose is distributed across the landscape.
Right.
So you don't have moose all going to like one forage area
to eat,
and increasing their population levels at that one spot, and increasing ticks and allowing a higher level of ticks to go on. So, but climate really is the big player,
the driving
here.
factor. Yep.
Yeah.
Now I know Maine and Vermont both are undergoing seasons that are designed to reduce moose densities to try to, well, as strange as it seems, by killing moose, you might end up helping them.
Right. Yeah. You simply may have to live with lower numbers of moose if you want the animals that are there to be healthy and not die.
Yeah, terrible death. Yeah.
It's just a horrible thing to see. These calves with literally hundreds of thousands of ticks on them, 100,000 ticks
Right.
on this poor little calf, or even an adult can cause them to die.
Right.
It's just a grotesque way for them to go.
So the moose population went from maybe a high of 7,500 back in the late 90s, say,
Yep.
and down to I think the Henry Jones, the current moose biologist, figures that somewhere around 3,000 or 3,500 today.
Yeah.
So less than half what we had 2 decades ago,
Right. Yep.
and still losing 90% of the calves.
Well, I'm not sure what they might have lost here, because we do have significantly lower densities of
Okay.
moose now than most parts of Maine.
Okay.
Well, at least we did when I left,
Right.
and I'm assuming that it's only gone down since then.
Right.
But that said,
What people
ticks
say,
are
well,
still an
why do you
issue.
have a moose season? If they're all dying, you shouldn't have a season. Does it make any difference?
so our season is so small. It's simply not making
39 moose killed last year, I think, for the
it's
season.
simply not making a difference. There was talk that if we really want to help moose, we should increase the season at this point.
Right.
But that's going to take an enormous educational
Right.
outreach effort, because people they don't understand it. Even
Right.
though we've tried to keep educating them to this problem over the years, there's a lot of emotion when it comes to
Right.
animals, and not always, people don't always
So
listen.
we'll end up with a few hundred moose probably in New Hampshire at the worst end of things, right? Once the density is down somewhere where ticks have a hard time finding a moose, there will still likely be some moose.
There probably will be some, but I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know how warm it's actually going to get here, and moose aren't designed for warmer temperatures.
So just they're stressed by
Right. So they may
above
simply
70.
not be able to survive here. In addition, it's not just winter tick that kills moose. Excuse me. So white-tailed deer, which are becoming much more prevalent as
'Cause
our
the lack of
winters
winter.
get shorter,
They survive at a higher rate.
are doing much better, and they are the primary carriers of winter tick, which doesn't bother deer because they're obligate groomers. So they
Okay.
brought the ticks.
Yep.
Moose didn't evolve with ticks. They don't groom until there are so many ticks on them, and then it's too late. So deer also have a parasite known as the brainworm,
Right.
and that kills moose. And that kills moose. That is more dependent on deer density levels.
Right.
So at lower deer densities, it's not a problem. But once you get above about 13 deer per square mile, moose begin to pick that up at a
Okay.
higher rate. And that
So a double whammy.
it's a double whammy. And our deer densities are increasing and will
Yep.
continue to increase as our winters get shorter. And that's just not a good
Right.
scenario for moose. So the parasites that deer bring to the table in our changing climate aren't good for moose. It's not
A
gonna
very
be-
sad thing to see. I mean, you worked with moose so long, it's just so sad to see us lose our moose because we failed to act.
Well, and moose is the least of the problems.
Right.
I mean, they are
Right.
literally the canary in the coal mine, and sadly, people in politics pay no attention
Right.
to the train that's rapidly coming our way.
Right. Wow. All right. Well, thank you very much, Chris, for some history of moose management in New Hampshire. Appreciate your 3.5 decades of work on moose here in New Hampshire. Thank you very much. I appreciated work with you for many of those years, and
We had some great time.
we sure did. And having fun reminiscing about that doesn't hurt. So awesome job, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank
This
you.
is wildlife biologist Eric Orr for What's Wild in New Hampshire.